welcome to the deep dive. Before we even get started, do us a massive favor and hit that like button and subscribe to the show. It really helps us keep bringing you these incredibly detailed, long-form explorations of the most fascinating material out there. So yeah, make sure you like and subscribe. Today's mission is an extensive, unvarnished review of a highly provocative new ebook. It's titled Grand Scheme of Things: Tree of Life, Hierarchy, and Natural Order by Conrad Riker. We are going incredibly deep today.
We really are. It's a massive text.
Yeah, it bills itself as a war cry wrapped in reason. Riker is aiming to uncover the history of our foundational institutions before they, according to his central thesis anyway, captured by feminists and Marxists. I'll tell you right now, if you are interested in the men's rights movement, the manosphere, or just understanding the biological and historical arguments for traditional male roles, this deep dive is going to be incredibly incisive, fascinating, and completely tailor-made for you.
Yeah.
We strongly encourage you to check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy the ebook for yourself. And make sure you follow the author at Conrad Riker on Substack.
Right. It is a sweeping, intensely detailed text that covers everything from ancient anthropology to modern corporate HR policies. But before we dive into the author's claims, we need to make something crystal clear. The material we are covering today is highly politically polarizing.
Very.
As your hosts, we are not taking sides or endorsing these viewpoints. Our mission is strictly to act as impartial reporters. We are simply here to unpack the data, the studies, and the philosophies presented in the original source material so you can fully understand Conrad Riker's arguments and the foundation he builds them on. We're just looking at the architecture of his thesis, step by step, delivering his claims exactly as he presents them.
Exactly. We are just the guides today, walking you through the text. And where Riker begins is by laying out what he calls the biological imperative. The foundational claim of this entire book is that hierarchy and male leadership are not social constructs engineered by a patriarchy. Rather, he argues they are deeply embedded biological imperatives. Nature itself, he claims, demands this structure for the survival of the species.
Right, he goes straight to the evolutionary record.
Yeah, he brings up a statistic early on that really caught my attention. 90% of ancient toolkits and weapons are found in male graves. He uses this data point to establish a concept he calls the primacy principle. Walk us through what he means by that.
So the primacy principle, as Riker defines it, is the idea that gender roles were biologically assigned for group survival, long before concepts like culture or society even existed. He relies heavily on evolutionary biology and anthropology here. He points to the fossil record to argue that these roles weren't socially imposed for oppression. He brings up the work of the prominent anthropologist Eric Trinkhaus, who spent years analyzing hundreds of Neanderthal skeletons.
And what did he find?
Trinkhaus found a staggering disparity in the fossil record. The male skeletons exhibited significantly more trauma. We're talking about fractured skulls, shattered ribs, healed spear wounds, and severe joint degradation. Riker's argument is that these weren't random accidents or the result of interpersonal brawls, they were occupational hazards.
Because they were the ones going out and doing the hunting, the fighting, the defending.
Precisely. The men were biologically optimized to take on the extreme physical dangers of taking down megafauna and defending the tribe from rival groups. Riker argues that you don't evolve a reinforced cranium or a skeletal structure designed for explosive anaerobic output from foraging or knitting. You evolve it from high-impact physical stress.
Right.
The male body, according to Riker, is essentially a biological shock absorber designed to protect the wider group from the brutal realities of nature.
And what's really interesting is that Riker doesn't just stay in the ancient past with Neanderthals. He looks at our closest living evolutionary relatives, chimpanzees, to prove that this isn't just a human anomaly. He brings up Jane Goodall's famous observations in Gombe, and he pairs that with a massive 2016 study published in the journal Nature.
That's a crucial part of his argument.
It is. That study confirmed that male chimps lead 98% of lethal raids against rival groups. Riker asserts that you can't blame primate behavior on a socially constructed patriarchy. He argues this is hardwired evolutionary biology. Natural selection rewards aggression, coordination, and dominance in males because that specific cocktail of traits is what keeps the broader group alive when resources are scarce.
That is the core of his extrapolation. He argues that you cannot simply write policy to bypass hundreds of thousands of years of evolutionary biology. And to demonstrate what happens when modern institutions try to ignore this biological baseline, the book highlights a deeply controversial 2019 U.S. Marine Corps infantry test.
Oh, the integration test.
Exactly. The military attempted to integrate women into rigorous, high intensity infantry roles to see if gender neutral standards could be maintained in combat scenarios. The attrition rate for the female participants was 97%.
97%.
Raker spends a significant amount of time breaking down why this happened, noting that it wasn't a lack of willpower, but a sheer physiological reality involving bone density, fast twitch muscle fiber, and the sheer anaerobic capacity required to carry a 100-pound rucksack under enemy fire. He uses this to argue that in domains requiring extreme physical endurance, pain tolerance, and aggressive risk taking, the biological differences between men and women are stark, measurable, and entirely non negotiable.
So if that's the reality in a combat zone, how does he apply this to a corporate boardroom? Because Riker takes this concept, which he terms hormonal architecture, and uses it to systematically dismantle what he calls the myth of gender equality. He argues that modern society is basically living in denial of basic endocrinology.
He really leans into the hormone data here.
He does. He brings in a 2022 meta-analysis from the journal Psychoneuroendocrinology that looked at top corporate executives. The study showed that Fortune 500 CEOs have, on average, 18% higher testosterone levels than the baseline male norm. Riker posits that testosterone is heavily misunderstood by modern culture. It doesn't just build muscle mass, he argues it builds empires. It fuels long-term vision, risk assessment, and a massive appetite for high-stakes gambles.
He argues that the modern narrative, the one which claims women are kept out of these top positions due to systemic sexism, is fundamentally flawed. He asserts that women generally don't lack opportunity in these spheres. Rather, they lack the specific androgenic architecture that drives a relentless, obsessive pursuit of hierarchy and dominance.
Which he ties to cognitive differences too, right?
Yes, the book pairs the testosterone data with cognitive studies, specifically citing Voyer's famous 1995 meta-analysis on spatial reasoning. This study found an astonishing 8-to-1 variance ratio favoring men in the ability to mentally rotate three-dimensional objects and systemize complex structures. Riker claims this biological reality is the actual reason why Silicon Valley's demographics feature 85% male founders. Men, he argues, are biologically wired for hyper-focusing on systems, code, and spatial navigation, whereas women are generally wired for people and social cohesion.
And he claims that when you force ideology over this natural grain, the results are catastrophic. He highlights a Stanford Graduate School of Business study that analyzed the fallout of California's SB 826. For context, that was the law that mandated corporate boards must have a 50% female representation.
Or the quota mandate.
It's exactly. The Stanford study showed an 18% drop in firm performance across the board for the companies forced to comply. Riker argues this drop wasn't a coincidence. It happens because companies were legally forced to prioritize demographic quotas over raw, competitive competence and the natural hierarchies that form when people are left to compete based on merit alone.
It's a very Darwinian view of corporate structures. Riker is essentially saying that when you artificially manipulate the hierarchy to achieve a socially desirable outcome, you break the machine. And that concept of breaking the machine is what leads directly into the next major pillar of his thesis. Riker argues that the West is currently undergoing a massive systemic degradation because it has abandoned logic in favor of feelings. He calls this the emotionalization of the West, and he traces it back to the capture of our academic and corporate institutions by postmodernism.
This part is fascinating because he actually points the finger at the mid-20th century French philosophers, specifically Jacques Derrida and the concept of deconstructionism. For listeners who might not be familiar with Derrida, how does Riker connect obscure French philosophy to modern HR departments?
Well, Riker argues that Derrida's philosophy essentially birthed the idea that objective truth doesn't exist. Deconstructionism posits that all language, all systems, and all hierarchies are just arbitrary constructs used by the powerful to oppress the marginalized. Therefore, according to this philosophy, there is no such thing as an objective standard of merit or excellence. Those are just words used to maintain power.
So it's a complete dismantling of standards.
Right. And Riker claims that once this philosophical virus infected the universities, it inevitably spilled over into the corporate world. If objective logic and merit are viewed as oppressive, then what replaces them? According to Riker, they are replaced by subjective feelings and emotionalism. This is what he calls the vulnerability doctrine.
Okay, let's unpack this vulnerability doctrine. This is his argument that traditional male metrics, competence, stoicism, logic, the ability to compartmentalize stress, have been actively demonized and replaced by a corporate mandate for emotional exposure. But he points out a massive, almost cruel paradox for men operating in this new
The
environment.
trap.
The trap, exactly. He cites a 2021 MIT study demonstrating that male leaders who actually follow this advice and openly share vulnerability in high-pressure environments are 34% less likely to advance in their careers. So Riker argues men are being brought into these HR seminars and told to cry, to be vulnerable, to share their insecurities, but when they actually do it, they are quietly, ruthlessly penalized.
Yes, he views it as a total trap. Riker argues that despite what HR departments claim, the biological expectation of male strength and stoicism hasn't actually gone away, it's just gone underground. When a man shows weakness, both men and women in the organization instinctually lose respect for him, even if they explicitly claim they want a vulnerable leader. Riker asserts this doctrine is essentially a tool designed to sideline competent traditional men by forcing them to play a game where the rules contradict human nature.
And he sees this same dynamic playing out in the war on merit, specifically through diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI initiatives. Riker doesn't mince words here. He claims DEI is essentially a coordinated purge of male excellence. He brings up a 2022 Harvard Business School analysis showing that the number of male engineers in top tech firms dropped by 40% following the implementation of strict DEI hiring policies.
That's a massive drop.
Huge. And he emphasizes that this drop didn't occur because the men suddenly lost their coding skills. It happened because the hiring rubrics were fundamentally altered. Technical mastery and coding efficiency were de-emphasized, while soft skills, demographic balancing, and culture fit became the primary drivers of employment.
To put a human face on this, Riker spends a lot of time discussing James Damore, the former Google engineer. Damore, as many listeners will remember, was fired after circulating an internal memo. What's crucial to Riker's argument is that Damore's memo heavily cited peer-reviewed evolutionary biology to explain why there might be natural gender disparities in tech, touching on the exact spatial reasoning and systemizing traits we discussed earlier.
And he was fired for it.
Yes, Google fired him for creating a hostile work environment. Riker views Damore as a modern martyr for objective truth, a man who brought data to an ideological purity test and was executed for it.
Rokers tries to quantify this massive shift with what he calls the Merit Erosion Index. According to his synthesis of corporate data, there has been a 33% decline in promotion rates for men in STEM fields since 2015. And the anecdotes he provides to illustrate this index are genuinely staggering. He details a specific case at Johns Hopkins involving a top-tier, highly published male cardiac surgeon.
I remember this section.
Yeah, this is a guy at the absolute apex of his incredibly demanding field. Yet, he was denied a promotion to head of the department because he allegedly lacked emotional intelligence and bedside manner. The position was instead given to a significantly less qualified candidate whose surgical outcomes were lower, but who was praised for being highly collaborative.
Right. Riker uses that Johns Hopkins example to make a very grim point. When collaboration and empathy replace technical rigor and surgical precision, the systems we rely on become fragile, and eventually people die. You don't want a collaborative surgeon, you want an obsessively competent one. He also points to the macro level, citing the UK's 2010 Equality Act. He claims this legislation, which heavily mandated diversity quotas across government sectors, drove down male civil service applicants by 27% in just a few years.
They just stopped applying.
Exactly. Riker argues this isn't a coincidence. Men are highly rational actors. They simply stopped applying to a system that they perceived was explicitly rigged to disqualify them regardless of their competence.
When you look at this corporate purge of male traits that Riker describes, the natural question is, where does this start? Does a man just show up to his first tech job and suddenly face this vulnerability doctrine? Riker says no. He argues this conditioning begins the moment a boy steps into a kindergarten classroom.
This is a huge part of the book.
It is, and this brings us to his intense critique of the modern education system. If you are a father listening to this, Riker's claims about the boy crisis and the feminization of education are going to be incredibly alarming. He highlights a fundamental demographic reality using U.S. Department of Education statistics. 76% of public school teachers are women. He argues this overwhelming demographic shift has fundamentally altered how classrooms operate, creating an environment that is naturally, perhaps even unintentionally, hostile to how boys naturally learn and behave.
He frames this environment using a metric he calls the institutional estrogen index. Riker argues that because schools are overwhelmingly run by female administrators and female teachers, the entire ecosystem naturally prioritizes female-coded communication styles and behavioral norms. We're talking about sitting still for 8 hours a day, raising your hand, sharing your feelings, avoiding conflict, and prioritizing collaborative harmony above all else. Consequently, the natural biological energy of boys, which involves rough and tumble play, physical movement, aggressive competition, and testing boundaries, is immediately pathologized.
And he has the data to back up how we deal with this supposed pathology. He points out that boys are 300% more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD than girls. Riker asserts that the vast majority of these boys don't have a neurological deficit. They have a biological surplus of energy that the system refuses to accommodate.
Right, the system adapts them to the classroom, not the other way around.
Exactly. He argues that we aren't actually educating boys anymore. We're chemically sedating them. We're putting millions of young boys on amphetamines like Ritalin and Adderall simply to force them to conform to a female-coded standard of docility.
The author views this as a profound tragedy, but also a massive strategic vulnerability for society. This brings us to a highly technical piece of data he includes, the DARPA 2021 study. Raker uses this to illustrate the dangers of prioritizing empathy over logic. DARPA ran highly sophisticated crisis simulations specifically. They simulated a catastrophic nuclear power plant meltdown. They trained 2 separate AI models to manage the crisis. One AI was trained purely on male-coded logic and utilitarian algorithms. Its only goal was to stabilize the reactor and minimize total casualties, regardless of the immediate human cost. The second AI was trained on empathy, social work principles, and equitable outcomes.
Wait, I want to drill down into this because this is a cornerstone of his argument. What actually happened in the simulation?
The logic-based AI outperformed the empathetic AI by 41% in terms of saving lives and stabilizing the grid. The empathetic AI failed because it froze. It attempted to prioritize the emotional distress of the trapped workers and tried to find a solution where everyone survived. By hesitating to make the brutal, necessary sacrifices, the empathetic AI lost control of the reactor, leading to a total simulated meltdown.
That's chilling.
It is. Riker uses the DARPA study to prove a terrifying point. While empathy sounds wonderful in a classroom or an HR seminar, it completely fails in survival scenarios. He argues that by suppressing male logic in our education system, we are actively waging war on the very cognitive framework required to keep a high-tech civilization running.
He pairs that high-level DARPA simulation with micro-level anecdotes from everyday schooling to show how widespread this is. He mentions a school in Connecticut that actually banned the game of tag on the playground because it was deemed too aggressive and created winners and losers. He points to a highly publicized case of a 6-year-old boy in Florida who was suspended from school for making a finger gun with his hand during recess. He highlights a petition in Canada called Let Boys Be Boys, where desperate parents protested a preschool's decision to remove all toy trucks, tools, and building blocks to force the boys to play in the kitchen center.
For Riker, these aren't just silly, isolated incidents of political correctness gone mad. He views them as symptoms of a systemic, ideological effort to deconstruct masculinity from the ground up. He argues the ultimate culmination of this is seen at the university level. He cites the infamous case of Evergreen State College, which instituted heavily mandated masculinity deconstruction workshops and highly aggressive equity policies. The result: Evergreen saw a 37% drop in male enrollment. Riker's takeaway is straightforward. When institutions relentlessly attack male nature, men don't usually fight back in the HR office. They simply withdraw their participation and walk away.
And that withdrawal brings us out of the schoolyard and directly into the home. Raker shifts his focus to what he calls the fatherhood void and the extreme bias of the family court system. He issues a blistering, uncompromising critique of family courts, which he claims have been wholly weaponized by feminists to erase paternal authority. To understand how far we've fallen, he contrasts the modern legal system with the ancient Roman concept of the paterfamilias.
This historical contrast is vital to understanding Raker's worldview. He explains that under Roman law, the paterfamilias, the male head of the household, held immense, almost absolute authority over his family. But Riker stresses that this authority was not a blank check for tyranny. It was inextricably tied to strict duty, absolute liability, and crushing accountability. If a child committed a crime or accrued a debt, the paterfamilias was legally and financially responsible. The authority existed solely because the liability was so absolute. Riker argues that this structured, balanced concept of male authority was dismantled starting in the 19th century with the introduction of the Victorian tender years doctrine.
Let's clarify the tender years doctrine for the listener. How did that change the legal landscape?
During the Industrial Revolution, as men moved out of the home and into factories, the courts began to adopt this highly sentimental assumption that young children naturally, biologically belong with their mothers, regardless of the father's competence or the mother's flaws. Riker asserts this doctrine was the beginning of the end for male authority in the home. It legally marginalized fathers, reducing them from the absolute head of the household to a secondary, optional figure.
And Riker lays out the catastrophic societal results of this marginalization. The statistics he provides on fatherlessness are grim. Currently in the United States, 72% of black children and 50% of white children are living without their biological fathers in the home. Riker doesn't just present these numbers in a vacuum, he correlates them directly with skyrocketing rates of youth crime, high school dropouts, depression, and teenage suicide. His argument is that without the stabilizing force of a father's discipline, structure, and physical presence, children inevitably drift into chaos.
He then explains exactly how the modern legal framework exacerbates this crisis. Riker points directly to the Duluth model of domestic violence intervention, which is standard training for police departments and courts across the U.S. Riker argues that the Duluth model is an explicitly feminist ideological framework. It assumes, by default, that domestic disputes are rooted in male attempts to assert patriarchal control. He argues this model effectively strips men of the presumption of innocence. If police are called to a domestic dispute, the Duluth model dictates that the man is almost always removed or arrested, regardless of who initiated the conflict.
He pairs the reality of the Duluth model with the staggering statistic that 70% of U.S. custody cases end in sole maternal custody. Riker's argument is that the family court system is a rigged casino. It treats fathers as nothing more than optional paychecks, extracting child support under threat of imprisonment, while denying them the actual legal authority to raise, discipline, and guide their children.
To demonstrate that this fatherhood void is a manufactured crisis rather than an inevitable reality, Riker looks internationally for contrasts. He points to Australia's 2006 Shared Parental Responsibility Act. When Australia reformed its family courts to make equal 50-50 parenting time the default presumption in a divorce, father involvement in children's lives literally doubled overnight. Yeah, the impact was immediate. He also cites Iceland's shared parenting laws, which are incredibly robust and heavily favor keeping both parents equally involved. As a result, 93% of children in Iceland live with both parents, and Iceland boasts some of the lowest youth crime and depression rates in Europe. Riker argues these international solutions prove that the devastation of the American family is a direct result of policy choices that heavily favor maternal custody and actively seek to marginalize men.
That marginalization of men in the home naturally bleeds into how society talks about men and the culture at large. This brings us to a massive focal point of the book, the narrative of toxic masculinity and what Riker calls the duty deficit. Riker traces the term toxic masculinity back to its origins in 1990. It was actually coined by a man named Shepard Bliss during the mythopoetic men's movement. But Riker argues that what started as a niche phrase to describe absent fathers was rapidly hijacked by Marxist and feminist academics. He claims they weaponized the term, turning it into a psychological control mechanism to neuter male power and shame men for their natural biological instincts.
Riker dissects this institutional capture by examining the American Psychological Association's highly controversial 2019 guidelines on men and boys. In these guidelines, the APA officially labeled traditional masculinity, which they defined as including traits like stoicism, competitiveness, dominance, and aggression, as psychologically harmful. Riker is absolutely scathing in his critique here. He asserts that treating the foundational traits of masculinity as clinical pathologies is pure ideological warfare disguised as science.
He contrasts this academic sanitized framing with the brutal physical reality of the labor market. While psychologists in air-conditioned offices are writing papers on toxic masculinity, who is actually keeping the lights on? Riker pulls data from the Bureau's labor statistics showing that men account for a staggering 93% of all workplace fatalities. Men are the ones doing the highly dangerous, dirty, lethal jobs, underwater welding, deep-sea fishing, high-voltage line repair, logging, mining that keep civilization functioning.
This stark contrast leads to one of Riker's most compelling concepts, the male duty paradox. Society, he observes, absolutely demands male sacrifice the moment things go wrong, but simultaneously, society demonizes the exact psychological traits like dominance, high-risk tolerance, and emotional stoicism that allow men to make those sacrifices in the first place. Riker fills the book with powerful, sobering examples of this paradox in action.
The examples he uses are incredibly heavy. He talks about the 19 Granite Mountain hotshots, an elite crew of firefighters who all burned to death defending a town during the Yarnell Hill fire. He points out the grim reality of 9/11, where 97% of the first responder fatalities running up the stairs of the collapsing towers were men. He even looks back historically to the sinking of the Titanic, noting that 68% of the men on board died, voluntarily stepping back from the lifeboats so that women and children could live. Riker notes with intense, palpable frustration that modern feminist academia actually mocks this kind of ultimate sacrifice, labeling it with terms like toxic saviorism or benevolent sexism.
It raises an incredibly important question that Riker poses directly to the reader. How can a civilization possibly survive when it pathologizes the very demographic it relies upon to run into burning buildings? He argues that heroism has been cynically reframed as a symptom of patriarchal conditioning. He views this as a deeply ungrateful and ultimately suicidal cultural shift. And he argues that this cultural attack is happening concurrently with a literal biological attack on men.
Which moves us into the physiological data Riker presents regarding a literal chemical war on male strength. The data he brings up here isn't just theory. It is alarming, measurable science. He cites comprehensive Johns Hopkins data from 2023 showing that male testosterone levels across the Western world are falling by about 1% per year. Riker argues this isn't just a cultural phenomenon of men sitting at desk jobs. He claims we are being actively chemically suppressed.
He focuses heavily on environmental factors, specifically pointing to the rampant use of endocrine disruptors. He highlights EE2, which is synthetic estrogen heavily used in oral contraceptives. Riker cites studies showing that massive amounts of EE2 are excreted, fail to be filtered out by municipal wastewater treatment plants, and end up leaching back into the drinking water supply, literally feminizing entire populations. To prove that this is an environmental and lifestyle crisis, Riker contrasts modern urban men whose testosterone now averages around a historically low 500 nanograms per deciliter with the Amish.
The Amish data is wild.
It really is. The Amish, who live physically demanding, agrarian lives devoid of microplastics, pharmaceuticals, and endocrine disruptors, average around 850 nanograms per deciliter. Riker uses this biological disparity to argue that modern Western men are living fundamentally out of alignment with their biological design.
And he connects this plummeting biology straight to cultural emasculation. He looks at Japan as the canary in the coal mine for the West. He discusses the phenomenon of Japan's herbivore men, an entire generation of young men who have experienced a total collapse of testosterone and have completely withdrawn from ambition. They don't date, they don't seek promotions, they don't buy cars, they just exist quietly in their rooms playing video games. And on the flip side of that withdrawal, he details the lethal extreme of karoshi, which translates to literal death by overwork. These are men who are ground into dust by the relentless economic machine until their hearts give out at their desks. Riker argues that under the current system, men are given two options: drop out entirely or drop dead.
Riker argues that this resulting isolation of men is not an accident. It is the intended outcome of decades of policy. He details the systematic, legal, and cultural destruction of male-only spaces. Fraternities, civic clubs, lodges, and even the Boy Scouts have been sued, integrated, or dismantled. He argues that the crusade against these spaces has left men dangerously isolated and without mentorship. To counter this, he brings in a 2023 Harvard study demonstrating that men who participate in weekly, male-only peer groups have 40% lower anxiety and drastically reduced suicide rates.
Let's just have that brotherhood.
Exactly. He also points to a massive success story, Finland's Men's Sheds program. This is a government-backed initiative where men simply gather in a workshop to build things, fix engines, and work with tools shoulder to shoulder. That simple program reduced rural male depression by an astonishing 52%. Riker asserts that men don't need face-to-face vulnerability therapy circles. They need shared labor, clear purpose, and brotherhood.
Up until this point, we've focused almost entirely on the male experience. But Riker does dedicate a massive portion of the book to the flip side of the equation. He tackles what he calls the female imperative. This is where he unpacks the incredibly controversial stance that motherhood is a biological imperative and a high, noble calling, not an oppressive patriarchal trap designed to keep women out of the workforce.
Riker roots this argument firmly in neurochemistry, trying to remove it from the realm of religious or social debate. He explains the biology of childbirth, specifically the role of oxytocin, the bonding hormone. During labor and nursing, a woman's oxytocin levels surge up to tenfold. Riker argues that this creates a profound neurochemical bonding anchor between mother and child that men biologically simply cannot replicate.
And he looks at historical attempts to override this.
Right, he does. To illustrate what happens when a society tries to legislate away this biology, Riker points to historical Marxist experiments. He discusses East Germany's massive system of state-run nurseries and Israel's early kibbutz movement, where children were intentionally raised communally to free women from traditional maternal roles so they could work. In both cases, Riker notes, the systems eventually fractured or completely reverted to traditional nuclear families because they violated the profound, hardwired biological link between a mother and her child.
Based on that biology, Riker claims that modern feminism has sold women a massive generational lie. He argues women were told they could have it all, that they could dedicate their 20s and early 30s to climbing the corporate ladder and just delay motherhood indefinitely. He cites a sobering 2019 UCLA study showing that female infertility skyrockets past the age of 35. By age 40, the chance of natural conception drops below 5%. Riker argues that biology has a very strict clock and ideology cannot negotiate with it. He points out that millions of women are reaching their late 30s, having achieved the corporate success they were promised would bring happiness, only to find themselves isolated and biologically out of time.
The macro result of this lie, according to Riker, is what he calls the demographic winter. He contrasts different European nations to show the devastating societal effects of these ideologies. He points to France, which, despite its secularism, has maintained relatively traditional pro-family tax policies and childcare subsidies that actively respect and incentivize the mother's role. As a result, France maintains the highest fertility rate in Western Europe.
As opposed to places like Sweden.
Right. He contrasts France sharply with Sweden and Germany, which pushed hyper-egalitarian, gender-neutral policies that treated motherhood as just another interchangeable outsourced job. Those nations, he points out, are now facing plunging birth rates, an aging workforce, and imminent demographic collapse. Riker's blunt conclusion is that when a society devalues the unique biological imperative of motherhood, the entire social and economic fabric of the nation unravels.
So after laying out all of this data, the evolutionary biology, the bias courts, the feminized education system, the plummeting testosterone, and the demographic winter, we finally arrive at the conclusion of the book. The ultimate question you are left with as the reader is, how does Conrad Riker propose fixing this? In the final chapters, he lays out a highly specific blueprint for restoration, and he starts on a macro level by pointing to what he calls the Hungarian model.
Riker holds up Prime Minister Viktor Orban's policies in Hungary as the only successful state-level pushback against institutional capture in the West. He details the specifics of Hungary's Family Protection Act, which directly ties massive economic incentives to traditional family formation. For example, the state offers massive housing benefits, and if a couple has 3 or more children, significant portions of their state loans are completely forgiving. They are literally paying citizens to rebuild the traditional family.
And they tackle the schools too.
Yes, he highlights their strict ban on gender ideology in public schools, legally replacing it with traditional biology. Furthermore, he points to Hungary's Fathers' Charter, which legally enshrines and recognizes fathers as essential co-creators of life with equal authority, rather than just treating them as financial providers in the event of a divorce. Riker notes that since these aggressive pro-family policies were implemented, Hungary has seen a 15% drop in its divorce rate and a surge in marriages.
But Riker knows that waiting for the government to save you is a losing strategy, so he doesn't just rely on state policy. He calls for immediate micro-solutions that men can implement themselves. Specifically, he calls for the formation of what he terms guilds. He envisions these not as casual drinking buddies, but as highly structured, hierarchical, skill-based brotherhoods. He wants these guilds focused on teaching young men physical trades, financial literacy, debate tactics, and the philosophy of natural law. He is urging men to aggressively rebuild the lineage of male mentorship that he claims DEI initiatives and modern culture have systematically destroyed.
Alongside these guilds, he introduces a mental toolkit he calls the Truth Resistance Framework. This is essentially a rhetorical method for men to logically dismantle ideological arguments and fight back against emotional manipulation in the workplace and in academia. He trains the reader on how to refuse the premises of postmodernism, how to demand objective data, and how to maintain stoic logic when facing HR tribunals or academic disciplinary boards.
Finally, Riker concludes this massive text with what he calls the grand scheme. He takes a sweeping, bird's-eye historical view to argue that unapologetic, hyper-focused male drive is the singular engine of human progress. He describes how it was overwhelmingly male obsession, systemizing, and risk tolerance that designed and built the Large Hadron Collider. He points to Robert Goddard, the father of modern rocketry, who endured decades of relentless mockery from the press, including the New York Times, only to pioneer the technology that put men on the moon. He highlights the grueling Lewis and Clark expedition, arguing it survives solely on masculine endurance, violence capability, and competence under extreme, unrelenting stress.
Riker brings all of this together using the philosophical concept of Indra's net. For those who aren't familiar, Indra's net is an ancient concept describing a vast cosmic web where every node is a jewel that reflects all the others, representing the interconnectedness of the universe. Riker appropriates this concept, arguing that strong, competent men are the load-bearing jewels in civilization's net. They maintain the power grid, they fight the wars, they invent the technology, and they provide the foundational security that allows culture, art, and empathy to even exist. Riker's concluding, unyielding thesis is that if you continue to weaken, shame, and chemically suppress those load-bearing nodes, the entire net of Western civilization will inevitably collapse.
It is truly staggering to look back at the sheer scope of this book. We have covered ancient biology, family law, the feminization of education, corporate DEI mandates, and sweeping historical achievements today. And again, as your hosts, our goal was simply to impartially deliver Conrad Riker's unvarnished arguments and the specific data he uses to support them. But having gone through all of it, it leaves you with a massive, provocative thought to chew on. If the very traits modern society has labeled as dangerous or toxic aggression, stoicism, dominance, hypercompetitiveness, risk-taking are the exact same traits required to keep the power grid online, rescue the miners, and invent the future, how long can a civilization realistically survive while actively, intentionally dismantling its own biological foundation? Are we rapidly approaching a tipping point where the harsh realities of nature simply override the ideologies of our institutions? It is a question you really have to ponder for yourself, regardless of where you stand politically.
It is certainly a text that demands a reaction. It challenges the reader to look at the data through a very specific, uncompromising lens, and it provides a wealth of historical and biological context to back up its highly polarizing claims.
Absolutely. It is a book designed to start massive arguments and force people to look at the data. If you want to dive deep into the history of our institutions and read these arguments, studies, and philosophies firsthand, you need to buy the ebook Grand Scheme of Things by Conrad Riker. Go check it out right now. It is available on Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books.
And make sure you follow the author on Substack at Conrad Riker to keep up with his latest writings and research.
That wraps up our incredibly extensive deep dive for today. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the show so we can keep bringing you these deep, unrelenting explorations into the ideas shaping our world. We will see you next time.